Welcome to our JavaScript web course. In this video, I will provide an introduction to the JavaScript language and its placement in the HTML document. First, I would like to go over the skills needed in order to learn JavaScript. Obviously, you need computer proficiency. You need to be comfortable using a computer. You also need to have a background in HTML and CSS. JavaScript does not run independently of the web page. It runs directly inside the web page, interacting with the content. Therefore, if you do not know HTML and CSS, you probably will not be able to understand how to use JavaScript in this class. You also need to be familiar with using a code editor, which you should be familiar with if you have a background coding HTML and CSS. You also need to have good file management skills because a web page consists of many files. And you also need to be comfortable and knowledgeable in using a browser. So we will be using a code editor to write the code. The browser will test the code. You will need to know where your files are, so you need file management skills. And because we are using an HTML document, you need to understand the HTML and CSS. So what exactly is JavaScript? It is a text-based scripting programming language that allows you to make web pages interactive. If you have worked with other programming languages, you are probably familiar with a compiler. JavaScript does not use that. JavaScript is what is called prototype-based. It is object-based, but the objects are not class-based, as in most programming languages. It is a client-sided language. It is interpreted and executed in the browser, not on the web server. It has nothing to do with the computer. It's purely for the web, for web pages, and it works in the browser. The browser is referred to as the client, as in client server. Not only is JavaScript used in the browser, it also can be used in Adobe Acrobat documents, used in GIS applications, and a newer application of JavaScript is in executing code on a web server. That will not be covered in this course. So where does JavaScript fit in? Let's go over the anatomy of the web page. We have HTML, which is the content layer. The HTML elements give structure and meaning to the page. We have CSS, which is the presentation layer. The properties and values determine the formatting and layout of the page. And now we have JavaScript. That is the behavior layer. It is the interactive response to user actions. So here we see these three languages. And by the way, these are all client-sided languages. These are the only client-sided languages that are used in the web page. They all work together. They do not work independently of each other. Therefore, you need to understand all three. So what do I mean by client-sided? The browser is referred to as the client, and the browser makes requests to the server for the web page. The browser interprets the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It executes it and displays it. That is all accomplished by the browser. Another term you may hear is the front end. So these are front-end technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You do not need the web server to execute the code. The web server hosts the files and it sends it down to the browser. The server, on the other hand, which is commonly referred to as the back end, a server language needs to be interpreted and executed on the web server, and the result would be sent down back to the browser as HTML. Some examples of server-sided languages or technologies: PHP, ASPX, C#, Python, and again, we do have server-sided JavaScript, which is Node.js. We will not be covering server-sided JavaScript in this class. To give you an idea of how JavaScript fits into the overall web development area, I would like to go over the history of the browsers. The web has been around for quite some time, and there have been many significant changes over the last 30 years. The first graphical web browser was actually created in 1990. However, the first popular web browser dates back to 1993, and that was called Mosaic. The Mosaic browser development is credited to a developer called Mark Andreessen. Andreessen and his team later in 1994 founded the Netscape browser. A year later, Microsoft released their Internet Explorer browser. Up to this point, web pages consisted of HTML. There was no CSS. Halfway into 1995, the JavaScript engine was released into the Netscape browser. So we actually had JavaScript interactivity in the browser before we actually had CSS. The Mozilla browser, which was the basis for Firefox, was released in 2002. And beyond that time, we have had several other browsers released, such as Opera, Safari, Chrome, and Edge. So we see that JavaScript was used pretty early in the area of web development. So how did the evolution of JavaScript into the browser come about? Well, we talked about the developer Mark Andreessen, who was responsible predominantly for the Mosaic and Netscape browser. He had an idea of making the web more dynamic, and he decided we needed a scripting language to do that. So Brendan Eich was contracted by Netscape to develop the language, and he is credited to be the father of JavaScript. In May of '95, Mocha was released in Navigator 2.0, so JavaScript was first called Mocha. Several months later, in September, Mocha was renamed LiveScript. And then in December of '95, it was given its final name of JavaScript. There was a partnership between Netscape and Sun Microsystems at this time. Sun Microsystems was developing the Java language, and because JavaScript was based somewhat on the Java language, the word Java became part of the name. There are two standards organizations that oversee some of the web languages that we use. The first is the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. They set the standards for the HTML and CSS language. We also have ECMA, or ECMA International, which stands for the European Computer Manufacturing Association, and they standardize not only information but other types of communication systems. And this is the organization that standardizes JavaScript. The W3C does not standardize JavaScript. JavaScript is also referred to as ECMAScript. So here we have our official versions of the JavaScript language dating from 1997, at which point it was under the control of ECMA International. And because JavaScript's official name is ECMAScript, it is referred to as ES. So we have ES 1, 2, and 3, the first three versions, being released 1997, 98, 99. There was no ES4. First main revision was 10 years later in 2009 with ES5. And this is where we see a lot of new features that deviated from the original or traditional JavaScript language. The second main revision came in 2015 with ES6. At that point, ECMA International decided that we would not keep on renaming the versions, but the versions would be named based on the year in which the changes were introduced. And ECMAScript 2015 introduced some very important changes that will be covered in this class. Following years also introduced important changes that will not be covered because they are used in more advanced applications. So the original JavaScript language was based on what is called the browser object model. We still use those browser objects today, but at that point, the only way to interact with the page was using document.write. The document object model was introduced in ECMAScript 5, which gives us the ability to interact with the page based on the HTML CSS document object model, meaning we can access the content, the elements, the attributes, the CSS properties and values, which gives us a lot more control over modifying the page. We will be learning about those differences in this course. I have another video which goes into detail with respect to placing the JavaScript code in the web page, but I will go over the syntax here. All JavaScript code is placed inside the opening and closing script tag. These are HTML elements. You will usually see the JavaScript in the head section or at the very end of the page on top of the ending body tag. The script element does not need a type attribute or a language attribute. The language attribute was actually removed from the language. The type attribute is optional, but not required in HTML5. JavaScript can be placed in an external file, similar to an external CSS file. In that case, you still need the opening and closing script tags. Nothing goes in between the opening and closing script tag in this case, and the external file is referenced by the src attribute. There are two ways to write a comment in the JavaScript language. A single line comment is indicated by 2 forward slashes. A multi-line comment is indicated by /**/. This is also a CSS comment. CSS comments are used inside the style tag or the external style sheet. JavaScript comments are used inside the script tag or in the external file. So please make a note of the 3 different types of comments that are used in the HTML document.